You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet. According to Article 3 of the Human Rights Act, no one shall be subjected to torture or to inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. Meanwhile, a new global report by human rights organisation Amnesty International says torture is not just alive and well in the world, but flourishing. Amnesty's new Stop Torture campaign reveals that 27 different types of torture were reported during 2013 and 14 in at least 79 countries. And 30 years after the UN Convention Against Torture was adopted, more than 100 states continue to torture. According to opinion polls conducted in 2008, people in Western European democracies such as Britain and Spain were most hostile to the idea of even some degree of use of torture, whereas people in countries such as Nigeria, Turkey and India seemed most willing to tolerate the idea. But the recent global poll by Amnesty International suggests more people are in favour of torture now. Their report, Stop Torture, says that 1 in 3 Britons think torture can be justified. So what's changed? I'd like you all to introduce yourselves now.
Thank you, Juliet. I'm Tom Davies. I'm the campaign manager at Amnesty International UK. I'm leading Amnesty's new 2-year Stop Torture campaign.
Jawad Fairooz, former MP from Bahrain and victim of torture.
Nicholas Mercer, I'm a parish priest in Dorset, but I was a military lawyer for 20 years, specialising in the law of armed conflict and human rights.
I just mentioned the poll then and how opinions had changed, and we'll get on to that next. But I think first of all, we'd like to hear from you, Jawad, if you could share your experience of being a victim of torture with us.
Definitely it is painful. It's painful in the sense that not due to the physical harm you get, due to the other main reasons in a way that you will face an unknown procedure they're going to be applied to you. At each moment you can expect anything, and this is most horrible feeling you're going to get, because most of the time you are blindfolded, you are isolated. Imagine I've been taken directly from my cell to the court. Even I don't know that it was a court, and I was not wearing my glasses, they didn't allow to me. Suddenly I can see so many flashing in front of me, taking picture of me. And then that time I realized I'm in the court. Away from that, I felt that the torture not to extract the information from me, or they want me to admit anything, just due to the revenge. In a way that after they interrogated me and I made whatever they wanted me to sign on, the torture started more worsely after that. So that means that the torture was just to take certain aggressive part of their side on me. They wanted to apply it, and in the meantime they wanted to revenge. I think the worst feelings I got when somehow I've been sexually been harassed, and deliberately they done it. But what made me to cry when after 1.5 when I was in the prison, they told me they took my wife to extract some information from her against me, and they applied torture on her. But thanks God, she had not been detained, but they tortured her. Believe me, at that moment I cried first time in my life, and it was the most painful feeling, more than the pain that I got when they tortured.
How do you still live with those experiences?
I think when I see what rest of the people been through, I know a friend of mine, he was a businessman and he was running a library that he kept with them just for 5 days. Then we received his body under the torture. When I see his story, when I see the story of the young boy, 16 years old, he was under torture for 3 days, then his body is being delivered to his family. I was there, I saw his body, and I know all details. Sometimes it gave me a little bit more relief that what I've been through is nothing compared to all this major. When I hear the story of the woman being raped, and they are still surviving with their pain, it gives me a courage to live with my pain more and more. But at the end, I'm blaming the international community that they are not doing enough. And for me, really, I was shocked when I saw this report of Amnesty that still people in 21st century, still they want to justify the torture. I think something's going wrong and we have to rectify it.
Well, Tom, that brings us to you, I guess. If you could just tell us then what your report highlights.
Well, we released a couple of pieces of research last week. One was specifically looking at the widespread use of torture and the issue of torture, as you highlighted at the beginning, Juliet. It's really quite sad, really, that Amnesty's had to launch another Stop Torture campaign. But this research really showed why we have done that. 155 countries have signed up to the Convention Against Torture. That was signed 30 years ago, 1984. And that was really a moment when the world came together to say torture is never acceptable, it's wrong, and it can never be justified. And yet what our research showed is that in the past 5 years, at least 141 countries have carried out torture. So that's nearly 3/4 of the world. So really the issue there is it's a case of broken promises. It's governments, on the one hand, making promises and saying, torture is never acceptable. And then on the other hand, it occurring in practice on a scale that I think could be described as a crisis. So, and as you said at the beginning, we identified 27 different types of torture techniques that we are aware of in the past year. And it's very brave of Jawad to speak out publicly about his own personal experiences, because torture is something that it's not just a case of someone being roughed up a bit and a little bit of a beating to try and get a little piece of information. Although that is a concern, it's much more than that. It's the kind of experiences that Jawad's talked about. It's some really quite barbaric practices. It's fingernails being pulled out with pairs of pliers, or it's electric shocks to people's genitals. It's really quite horrific things. And then the second piece of research that we released as well was about attitudes. It was a global opinion poll that we carried out in 21 different countries, 21,000 people interviewed. And it was threefold. It was about attitudes to torture in terms of acceptance. It was also about people's personal fear for their safety in terms of risk of torture, and also about the need for clear rules. And there were positives and negatives, really. The two areas that really were alarming and of concern is that globally 44% of people that responded had a personal fear of torture if they were to be detained, so almost half the world. And globally 36% of people felt that in some instances torture could be justified. That's across the board, across the world. But the more positive response was that 82% of people believe that clear rules on torture is necessary. So there's some optimism there to work with, but there were also some quite alarming figures.
Thank you very much, Tom, for highlighting the points of the report so eloquently. You started with what happened 30 years ago. I suppose, Nicholas Mercer, then, what's happened with the world now? You spent a lot of your time trying to change attitudes on behaviour in the British military during the invasion of Iraq. Start where you like, but your response to that, or where you think morally the world's changed, why it's different, or your experiences in Iraq also would be, would like to hear as well.
Well, my personal background is that I was the command legal advisor in the Iraq War, and I came across the mistreatment of prisoners of Iraqi prisoners in a prisoner of war camp. They were being mistreated by the interrogators, and so I intervened in that, pointing out that this breached international law, and that caused all sorts of problems. People said no, it didn't. People said that I got the law wrong. People said it was perfectly justified. So I met that initial resistance very strongly, and if it hadn't been for the International Committee of the Red Cross supporting my observations, I think that would have caused me some sort of career damage. But I think what that did was expose to me the wider use of torture by the United Kingdom, and it's opened my eyes to the wider use of torture across the globe, as we've heard from Tom this morning. And really it's opened my eyes to this pernicious activity that seems to have gained some sort of acceptance. Now, I think Tom pointed out to start with that it is in breach of international law. The UN Convention Against Torture, UNCAT, was passed 30 years ago. Countries are meant to outlaw it in their domestic law, and we have done. But actually what I found since then is it's very skillfully covered up through all sorts of techniques. It either isn't prosecuted, or, for instance, we've introduced secret courts in 2013 to stop applicants who've been tortured from having their cases heard in open court, so we don't hear about it. I think there's also another element is that people have seen television programmes. They've seen Zero Dark 30, they've seen Jack Bauer's 24, which gives a sort of, film version of torture. Well, it doesn't work like that. And as we've heard from Jawad, there was no time sensitivity. One of the questions I get is, what about the ticking bomb scenario when I teach this? Well, as we've heard from Jawad, there was no ticking bomb. It was just there to humiliate, gain revenge, and so on and so forth. And actually just dealing with the ticking bomb, which I think underlies a lot of people's attitudes to torture. Well, it must be justified in those circumstances. Well, the reality is that, first of all, if they don't know, they're just going to lie to you, because torture can't produce a result. And secondly, if they're committed, they won't tell you. And actually, in the Israeli Supreme Court, they considered this. And actually, most of the so-called time-critical cases were nothing of the sort. This was just gratuitous violence by the state. It goes without saying, morally abhorrent and degrades the individual at the same time. And it's shocking that we're still in this position 30 years later, or at all.
Was it 44% of the world believe they are themselves individually at risk of torture?
Would be personally at risk of torture themselves. And this is one of the things that we found with our research, is that the vast majority of people who are tortured across the world are not individuals who are accused of major terrorist offences, for example, which is the narrative that often has become most acceptable and commonplace. But it's actually people who are held in detention centres right across the world, accused of a variety of crimes, be they petty, street crime, theft, etc., or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, being in a demonstration, standing up to the state, showing their opposition to certain policies and practices that the government of that time and that country might have. And it's in that context of being in a detention centre where people are being tortured. And our analysis shows that if you have this global ban and you have this commitment to countries not torturing, and yet in practice 141 countries in the last 5 years have tortured, as I've mentioned, then there's a big gap, and that gap ultimately is the issue of safeguards not being applied in practice. And what do I mean by safeguards? It's quite simple things, really. It's if you, Juliet, you're detained and you're being interrogated and there is no lawyer present, you're in an environment where it's conducive to torture. You could be tortured. Or if you are detained and you're tortured and you make an allegation of torture, unless there is an independent medical examination of you, then there will never be justice for you. The torture will occur with impunity. Whilst judges accept evidence obtained under torture in courts of laws and to convict people, then torture will continue to flourish, as you said at the beginning. So these are the safeguards that we are campaigning for in this Amnesty's New Stop Torture campaign, to get those kind of safeguards applied in practice.
And you mentioned, Nicholas, about how it got covered up in the courts in these secret cases, and how people's medical conditions and records aren't sort of used in their case for seeking asylum in the UK and not being deported. Do you think because of that covering up, or that sort of gap in knowledge in society, and the mainstream media sort of entering a gap, which then sort of presents this other picture, has skewed how people in the UK view torture?
Because I think it has, that there isn't a public image and impression of how the state conducts itself, about decency and fair play, Ian Cobain's book, Cruel Britannia, charts the history of torture by the UK state from 1944 to date. I was horrified when I read the book, and I form a footnote in that book because from 1944 onwards, through the colonial campaigns, we tortured people in Cyprus, Malaya, Aden, Kenya. The British were torturing, and the torture was utterly brutal. One camp guard said that the torture he saw of the Mau Mau was worse than anything he had suffered as a prisoner of war in Japan. But that's a narrative people don't want to hear. Then they refined their torture techniques, and I was talking to Jawad about that earlier on, that they realised if you left marks on the body, then of course litigation would follow. So the 5 techniques were developed to internalise the torture on the victim. And of course that was banned by the European Court of Human Rights in 1978, but found its way back into operations in Iraq in 2003. And again, that's been, only one person's been brought to trial. Most of it's been covered up or dismissed because people don't want to hear that narrative. Civil claims have been put into secret courts. And for instance, very interesting, this morning in today's Telegraph, the British government are trying to prevent publication of large parts of the CIA torture report because it implicates our own country. So this is very skillfully suppressed by the state.
You mentioned the 5 internalised torture methods.
Yeah.
Could you just explain what they are?
Yeah, the 5 techniques were developed at the end of the colonial campaigns in conjunction with the Americans, and it is hooding, which is sensory deprivation, it is stress positions, it is deprivation of food, deprivation of sleep, and also white noise. So they're used either individually or conjunction with each other, and it internalises the stress. It can cause psychiatric damage, and of course by internalising the stress it's perceived that somehow you get more information out of people, and of course it leaves no marks.
Yes, Tom.
Just to add in on that, I mean, it's frightening really how torturers can use their ingenuity to get away with torture. And I'd just give you a very brief example of a case that Amnesty's working on from Mexico. She's called Claudia Medina. She was picked up from her house in the early hours of the morning, taken to a naval barracks where she was abused in the most horrific of ways. But one thing that really stood out, and I shouldn't laugh about it, but it just seems so ridiculous almost, is that her body was wrapped in plastic, specifically to avoid the kind of marks that that Nicholas is referring to in terms of internalising that experience of torture. And that's one of the other things that's quite worrying about the use of torture worldwide is just the kind of the use of everyday objects being turned into torture implements.
And also it's this transference from physical to mental torture, which is not so obvious on the outside, but has probably a greater legacy in the person who's tortured.
I can remember a lot of such cases. For example, before they take you to the prosecutor for question you, they let you to be awake for more than 24 hours standing. That happens. They put the country's leaders' photo in my cell. Then I have to face them, and believe it, 24 hours I have to kiss them. And they are back the door looking at me. And they say, at any moment we found you feeling down, we will bring the dogs. And I could hear the dogs behind the door, they are barking. And I was like this for 24 hours. And next day they took me to the integration. That's, I was so exhausted. To be free by yourself, then you have to say what they want. Another example, believe it or not, I've been tortured in the health center, clinic, while they are taking your blood pressure. They are pretending that they are applying torture on you, and then they say he is nurse, but he's slapping you, he's using so many bad words against you and so on. I've been tortured in the prosecutor's office. So these places that you think that it will be a safeguard at least from you, you will find that most horrible way of torturing. I think mainly I blame the international community. They don't done much. Yes, there are now so many initiatives, steps in the Human Rights Councils there, and but the political interest is more aware for them. It is a priority than these human rights values at all. I think now times comes that this international political relationship should be linked with these human rights values. Any country is not respecting, and any country is violating human rights, then there should be a boycott, some type of a boycott, and they should be accountable, definitely.
How has it happened? How is 30 years of the Human Rights Act making it illegal? How has it just now led to the new report, Stop Torture, by a global organisation, highlighting an issue and saying these very basic safeguards need to be implemented again? You blame the international community. Where do you think it went wrong? And where does the education need to start, Nicholas?
Well, we start in schools, and we do take our human rights values to schools, but of course there's huge public pressure to get out of the Human Rights Act. So, I mean, that's very difficult. People say we want to rip it all up, and it's all seen through the prism of deportation, but Article 3 is about prevent torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. So that too has a counter-narrative that's skillfully put forward. I think religion does play a part in all of this. I would do as a clergyman, and respect for the individual and man being made in the image of God. But of course religion is falling away. And I think that media does desensitise us from this. We see the Jack Bauer on 24 and we think, great, or Zero Dark 30, which glorifies torture. And the reality is something that most people could not bear to watch if they saw what was happening for real. I think those are three things that I can think of.
Just a small example to see that there is no serious steps. I can bring the case of Isa Al-Ali. He applied asylum here in UK. He arrived on 14 February 2014. He kept in the prison of the airport. And although he given enough proof that he been tortured, he been in prison, and now he been sentenced for 5 years. Yesterday they wanted to deport him to Bahrain, and they gave him the ticket. Twice I talked with, he's 19 years old. He's supposed to be deported yesterday back to Bahrain. But the activists and so many MPs and the media, they reflect his news, then now they want to review his case once again. So such obvious case, so clear case that someone is being tortured, and if you're gonna hand it over him to the country, once again he'll be tortured, how come and UK are willing to do so?
But I think, picking up from what Nicholas said, the rhetoric of deportation and immigration, the narrative is it sort of wins over the evidence of torture and inhumane activity in countries where people should be, in accordance to British government, deported back to. And I think that's where the gap that we talked about earlier has been filled, and without, not from knowledgeable sources. The gap has been filled by perhaps mainstream media and this desensitization of torture that, we have a generation of people growing up looking at, and actually hearing your story. It's amazing that you can tell it so well. How hopeful are you, Tom, then, that with this global campaign, that it's come to this stage now, but where do you see it going?
Yes, well, I mean, just to touch on some points that people have raised, I mean, it seems clear that there's been a shift to panic over principle, if you like, whether that's to do with immigration, and we should not forget that it's not a crime to seek asylum, or whether that's to do with the security agenda. So people seem to have bought into that narrative. But where do we go with the campaign? I mean, this is the fourth campaign that Amnesty's run in our 50 years of working on torture. Like I said at the beginning, in some ways it's a sad occasion that we've had to launch this campaign, this Amnesty Stop Torture campaign again now. But we have identified 5 countries, Mexico, Morocco, Nigeria, Philippines and Uzbekistan, where we believe that global pressure, whether that's from the 3 million Amnesty supporters out there across the world or the international community, where that pressure applied on those 5 countries, on the key issue of safeguards within those countries, we can see progress in those countries. And that will benefit both individuals who are currently seeking justice or currently detained, or many, many more in the future. So we have to be optimistic. You know, we're launching a campaign to try to improve the lives of people currently now or in the future. So I would urge people to join the Stop Torture campaign, to join Amnesty, to stand up against torture, because it is truly a barbaric and inhumane act that can never be justified. And I think the more that people are exposed to the realities of torture, hearing Jawad's personal account, or not watching certain television programs or certain films, or at least seeing them in the context that they are fiction, the reality is so much worse, then I think we have to be optimistic that we can see improvements.
We're almost coming to an end, sadly, but Jawad, you look to the international community, but what would you say to other victims of torture who are living with the legacy of the psychiatric torture techniques that have been used?
More you express about it, more you feel relief. More you be in contact with the similar victims, you can help them and yourself. At the same time, there is bright side of it. We have to think about it. That's it will not continue for long. It will be just for a short time. But it depends on our ability and how we be more stronger and fight. Fight not just to say. We have to make plans, and we want to play whatever pressure we can. And we should believe that the change is coming, that this will be ended. At the end, I can say that in the way that international community are combined all their efforts to fight the terrorists and terrorism, they have to do the same about the torture.
Thank you very much, Jawad, for sharing your experiences, story, thoughts and hope for the future. And finally, Nicholas.
The torture goes on across the globe, but I'd like to start at home. People understand it, to make people aware of what's happening, the fact that it's prohibited under international law, bring those to account, and as a state have a complete zero tolerance. That's in the practice complicity and everything else that goes with it, because it's slipped so far that we need to pay it serious attention.
That was Nicholas Mercer, parish priest and former military lawyer specialising in human rights. And we were also joined by Jawad Fairooz, former Bahrain MP and himself a victim of torture, and Tom Davies, leading the new Stop Torture campaign from Amnesty International UK. Thanks to all my guests.